Indeed, what's an epic? Well, epic, this is from Abrams and Harpham, a glossary of literary terms. Some of you have seen this before. In its strict sense, the term epic or heroic poem is applied to a work that meets at least the following criteria. It is a long verse narrative on a serious subject told in a formal and elevated style and centered on a heroic or quasi-divine figure on whose actions depends the fate of a tribe, a nation, or in the instance of John Milton's Paradise Lost, the human race itself. Now drop down to some of the characteristics accorded epic by Tekla Bood, of Oregon State University. I've highlighted some of the qualities that she feels are essential to the epic down below, and you'll see that they largely agree with what we get from Abrams and Harpham. First, epics were about people whose personal qualities were considered exemplary in their culture, civilization, or country. In other words, heroes like Achilles and Odysseus. Go back up to Abrams and Harpham, right? A heroic or quasi-divine figure is usually involved in one of these epics. Second, they took place in settings that are universal in one way or another. Now, this is one of the four qualities mentioned down here below that I do not think appears substantially in what Abrams and Harpham have given us. So let's go down to the third. These early epics also invoked deities or the supernatural. Athena, Zeus, Ares. You have God the Father and God the Son, as well as Satan in Paradise Lost. We're going to get to this very soon, but what do you have in Milton? Sorry, what do you have in Wordsworth? Is it not nature? But yeah, get the quality down first. These early epics also invoke deities or the supernatural, right? We get something like this going on up above, this business of a heroic or quasi-divine figure. I think very often a heroic figure and a quasi-divine figure, or in fact a divine figure. So we're very close to what's being said up top. Here with the third item. The fourth, finally, an epic is often used or read as a foundational cultural text. And that is what I think we see above in the part of the Abrams and Harpham definition, which goes on to predicate of the heroic or quasi-divine figure actions upon which depends, right, the fate of a tribe, a nation, and then again, the entire human race if it's John Milton's Paradise Lost. First, though, what is an epic? Well, if we turn to Abrams and Harpham, a glossary of literary terms, 10th edition, which is typically a reliable guide to questions of this kind. In its strict sense, the term epic or heroic poem is applied to a work that meets at least the following criteria. It is a long verse narrative on a serious subject told in a formal and elevated style and centered on a heroic or quasi-divine figure on whose actions depends the fate of a tribe, a nation, or, in the instance of John Milton's Paradise Lost, the human race. Now, Abrams and Harpham go on to distinguish between traditional epics and literary epics. I don't think that's a distinction that we have to worry too much about for our purposes here, so I'm going to drop down to Tekla Bood, who has got some very interesting things to say about epic and how we use the term these days and how they used to use it and how you'd want to use it in a class like this. Right? You could read through that on your own. What I'm going to do in this moment is drop to those first, second, third, and fourth qualities of the epic that she distinguishes, and we can put them against what Abrams and Harpham distinguish as qualities of the epic and come up with something of a composite. Well, first, according to Bood, or Boudet, they were, quote, about people whose personal qualities were considered exemplary in their culture, civilization, or country. In other words, heroes like Achilles and Odysseus. And you can see that accords very closely with what Harpham and Abrams, or Abrams and Harpham, have to say up above when they say that the epic is centered on a heroic or quasi-divine figure, on whose actions depends the fate of a tribe, a nation, etc., as we will see down below. The second quality, Boudet, distinguishes epics took place, or take place, if anybody's going to write one these days, in settings that are universal in one way or another. Either the narrative takes place over a wide range of places and times, involves a lot of travel, or uses a single place, like the Walls of Troy, to explore ideas and themes that range widely over the human experience. I found this one to be a little bit less generally accepted as a important quality of the epic, worthy to be placed on the same plain as what she distinguishes as her first, third, and final quality. So I'm not going to pay much attention to the second one. But the third one is, of course, as we will see here, very accordant with what Abrams and Harfam have to say. Third, these early epics, I think even later epics, also invoked deities or the supernatural. And you can see, talk a little bit above about the quasi-divine figure, right, on whose actions depends the fate of a tribe. So sometimes the hero has a kind of supernatural kind of quality, or somehow a kind of is a demigod, quasi-divine, what have you. I'm thinking of some of the figures that we see, for example, in the Iliad, right? But you often have these independent. You have these supernatural beings who are independent of the heroes. Athena is not the hero of the Iliad. It's Achilles and perhaps Ulysses. Ulysses being the hero of the Odyssey, right? Odysseus. And not some of the, Poseidon, for example, some of these gods that he runs into. So there's often independence there, right? Between the hero, who has a kind of almost a demigod kind of quality about him, typically it's a him, and these supernatural beings who tend to occupy the background, if not the foreground. Sometimes they come into the foreground of the epic arena, okay? And you can think of, for example, Paradise Lost. Jesus actually shows up at one point in Paradise Lost, right? Well, okay, what about this final, the fourth quality? I think this also is we're going to find quite accordant with what we find in Abrams and Harfam. An epic is often used or read as a foundational cultural text. And I agree with Boudet that this last quality is incredibly important. The Iliad and the Odyssey, which were long poems about heroes doing heroic deeds and helping or hindered, being helped or being hindered by the gods, ultimately came to quite represent something about a culture to itself. They were the ideals that people wanted to live up to or rebelled against by rejecting. Okay, which I think is a little bit vague the way she puts that, but the gist of it is that this has to be like a really important book, the epic, and it has to be very culturally central. That's what makes it important. It is, for example, in the story of Paradise Lost, it's what could be more important than the formation of the human race, right? If you happen to be human, that's going to be quite a foundational cultural text, even going to transcend specific particular cultures, is it not? So this is a really important part of what goes on in epic, right? It's got to have this sort of cultural centrality and magnitude, because if it doesn't, it's you just sort of the word epic just doesn't seem to fit, right? It's the word epic is too big for something that is particular or not central or peripheral, something that's peripheral. What then about the prelude is epic? As its title indicates, and here I'm quoting from Paul Cantor's wonderful essay on the politics of the epic, Wordsworth, Byron, and the Romantic Redefinition of Heroism, as its title indicates, this poem was intended to be merely the prelude to the great epic Wordsworth hoped to write, a project he called The Recluse, on which he worked intermittently for years but produced nothing more than fragments. Thus, the prelude is generally regarded as the closest Wordsworth ever came to writing an epic poem, and stands as one of the most significant romantic achievements in the genre. It is divided into 14 books. We are not reading all of them, as you know, in its finished published version of 1850. It is written in an elevated blank verse, so it has that stylistic component as well as that component of magnitude, or just length, right? Epic in length. Epic also, you could argue, in its stylistic quality, it is written in an elevated blank verse that often has a Miltonic ring to it, a little bit like Paradise Lost. And it contains epic diction, epic similes, and many other signs of Wordsworth's attempt to work within the established epic tradition. For example, as we have already said, it has a sort of supernatural being in it, one which will remind us of some of the supernatural beings we see in the old ancient epics, as well as in Paradise Lost. In this case, it is nature. But if one looks at the beginning of the poem, Cantor continues, where the epic poet traditionally invokes his muse, one can see how radically Wordsworth differs from his predecessors. The invocation to the muse in the classic epic is brief and to the point. The classic poet knows what his subject will be, Homer's wrath, or the wrath of Achilles, or in Virgil's Aeneid, arms in the man, and he plunges without hesitation into narrating the story he has to tell. But Wordsworth, on the other hand, is massively unsure of himself as the prelude opens, And it takes him some 270 lines in book first that you read to get to the narrative of his childhood that turns out to be the story, or the story, his poem is to recount. In the opening lines, Wordsworth is searching for an epic theme suitable to his ambitions as a poet. I would ask that you recall, according to that incredibly important fourth quality of the epic that we read about in the last plate, it should be, should it not, this epic theme. The epic itself should be a foundational cultural text, one which has foundational cultural themes. And it should be one that, quote, ultimately comes to represent something about a culture to itself. It should have a present public dimension or significance. It should not be some private thing, something that is small and private and not of general, kind of relevance. So Wordsworth is in the mood to write something like that, something with such qualities, something epic. He believes he has the freedom. This is some of what we pick up in book first is he's mulling around and wandering around trying to decide, literally wandering around, in the landscape, but also wandering around intellectually, right? And he gives us evidence that he, is pretty confident that he can do such a thing. He has the freedom. He has the economic freedom, right? And he has the personal energy. He's not sick to devote himself to the task. And he certainly aspires to take his place. He's got tremendous aspiration to take his place among the great practitioners of the genre with, quote, an assurance of some work of glory there forthwith to be begun. But what in the world is Wordsworth going to write about in his epic? What is going to be, right, the cultural significance, the cultural story that he has to tell? What indeed? After rejecting a number of other more traditional candidates for his epic story and theme, a good example, quote, how in tyrannic times some unknown man, unheard of in the Chronicles of Kings, suffered in silence for the love of truth. You can see how that might be worthy of epic treatment, correct? And after almost giving up, suddenly Wordsworth is on solid ground as he begins to narrate the events from his childhood that started him on his long journey to become a poet. On the brink of artistic despair, then, he has found his epic theme. After all, it will be the development of his own mind, his growth as a poet. Look at the title page. Epic becomes autobiography. Wordsworth will tell the story of his life, his own life, up to the point where the prelude begins. That is the point when he's ready to write a great epic. The prelude is a kind of proto-postmodernist enterprise, a poem that circles back to its own beginning and tells the story of its own creation. Isn't the, quote, growth of a poet's mind one of those particular topics, those more particularist topics lacking in more general cultural relevance? I mean, compare this to maybe writing a long poem, an epic poem about Napoleon. Think about that. Napoleon was a big figure at this time that he was working on the poem. Well, Wordsworth's answer would be no. This isn't a topic that is so particularist, right? So lacking in general cultural relevance as to render it unfit for epic treatment. Not if you believe, right, that we are all poets. You will not say that the topic of the growth of a poet's mind is unfit for epic treatment if you believe that we're all poets. There's your general cultural relevance. All of us are poets. All of us at least could be poets if we, right, developed our poetic natures. And we are such because we all possess imaginations. And this brings us back to one of those very basic premises shared by all these romantic poets, this emphasis upon the imagination over the rational mind. So no, not if you believe that we're all poets, and not if you believe that as poets, you have to have a certain definition of the poet for this really to work. As poets, we are, quote unquote, the rock of defense of human nature. Now I'm taking up the preface, which we didn't say much about until this moment. I'm going to read you a little paragraph out of the preface. And it's a poetry, it's a preface, it's a passage of high praise of poetry and the poet. Poetry is the breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge, the Wordsworth of the preface argues. It is the impassioned expression which is the countenance of all science. Emphatically may it be said of the poet, as Shakespeare has said of man, quote, that he looks before and after. And you can see how here, by quoting Shakespeare as he does, Wordsworth more or less makes equivalent or continuous the mind of the poet, the activity of the poet, and the activity of the common man who looks both before and after. Goes on to say that the poet, right, and we're all poets, again, keep this in mind, he is the rock of defense for human nature. Again, you see that, the sense that all of human nature is at stake when we look at the mind and the activity, poetic activity of the poet. The poet is the upholder and preserver, carrying everywhere with him relationship and love, in spite of difference of soil and climate, of language and manners, of laws and customs, right? In spite of all these different cultural and political things that might occur, like in Germany or France or China or England, right? This is something that binds us all together as poets, binds us all together as humans because we're all poets. In spite of things silently gone out of mind and things violently destroyed, the poet binds together by passion and knowledge, the vast empire of human society, as it is spread over the whole earth and over all time. You see these extraordinary, these extravagant claims being made by Wordsworth for the power of the poet, right? The power of the poet, the centrality of the poet in all the vast empire of human society, whatever the particular human society. This is the opposite of particularism, is it not? The objects of the poet's thought, he continues, are everywhere. Though the eyes and senses of man are, it is true, his favorite guides, yet he will follow wheresoever he can find an atmosphere of sensation in which to move his wings. Poetry is the first and last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. Having heard this passionate defense of the poet against a charge of particularism that would, when the poet attempts epic, disqualify his work, let's descend to a particular. Particular being discussion 6, Q2, on being fostered alike by beauty and by fear. This is what y'all had to say. Elizabeth, Wordsworth's speaker says, and the bird which was the captive of another's toils became my prey, which leads to, quote, and when the deed was done, I heard among the solitary hills low breathings coming after me and sounds of undistinguishable motion, steps almost as silent as the turf they trod. Very good quoting, Elizabeth. I think you're onto something here in quoting this passage. He, the Wordsworth persona, is fearful that he has now become the prey, but it is mysterious because we will never know if Wordsworth is being hunted in the forest, even though he does not matter. It does not matter. John agrees. Was there something following Wordsworth? We do not know because Wordsworth only tells us what he was thinking in that moment, as though what he was thinking in that moment is what is important, not the objective fact one way or the other. What is important in this episode, this is, again, in this moment, Elizabeth, what is important in this episode is that the fear he felt was real, and it shaped his childhood. Stephanie writes, this and the other episodes of early fear in nature, recorded in book first, were indeed, quote, experiences that shaped the persona and continue to have an impact on him as he simultaneously recounts the tale in his adulthood and memorializes it in writing. And Bray, I think, agrees, indeed, and goes on to note, importantly, that the shaping force of fear is not destructive, even if the memory of it casts a darkness over him for days. Just as Tintern Abbey celebrates the gentle nurturing provided by the beauteous forms, the prelude shows that fear helps awaken the soul through consciousness and humility. And I think that is very well said and accurate. As John notes, here again, as in Blake, the mistake is the fear of fear itself. Not that you don't take it seriously as an instructive presence, an even worse mistake, discounting it entirely, but avoid being so afraid, right? So consumed by one's fear that you never venture out into the woods again, or you misunderstand the nature of what's just happened and you imagine that there's a boogeyman out there, again, as in Blake, right? A Nobo Daddy or some sort of figure out there that is going to punish you, right? And you become superstitious in that moment. And I think Wordsworth is no more interested in our becoming superstitious from our experiences of fear in the natural world than in our discounting those experiences altogether. After all, as Danielle asserts, quote, humanity often runs when faced with death. This is often where the saying or idea that the Grim Reaper chases us all until we become too tired to run. But after all, it's a mistake to run. Now, not that Wordsworth never runs. Wordsworth usually rejects such a notion of death, yes, but we do see dramatized in a couple of these passages. There's one in particular where he becomes very, very uneasy and almost makes the mistake, okay, of running headlong away and getting nothing out of it. getting nothing out of the experience. Olivia zeroes in on a passage, the passage, okay, this passage that I'm talking about, in which the persona starts, if not running away, rowing away. You remember this one. When from behind, this is the culmination, this is the climax of this episode, that craggy steep. He's just stolen this little boat, right? And he rows into this, like into the lee of this hill, and then he starts to row out again. And this big mountain hanging behind the big crag hanging behind the little hill in front of him, and hiding that big crag, and being hidden by the little hill, suddenly begins to appear. And it's a little bit like those steps he hears behind him, where he hears the footsteps after he's done the thing with the robins. When from behind that craggy steep, till then the bound of the horizon, a huge cliff emerges up from behind it, as with voluntary power instinct upreared its head. I struck and struck again. He's rowing like mad away. Well, let's turn to the next plate, where we have some critics who talk about that specific episode. Here we have our buddy Harold Bloom. We've called upon him before, and we will again, as well as Baylor University, on that very passage, and on more generally Wordsworth's Ministry of Fear. Here's, begins by talking about the raven's nest. When he hangs above the raven's nest, sustained by the group of fingertips, he hears a strange utterance in the wind, and perceives a motion unlike any ordinary one, in a sky that does not seem a sky of earth. At such a moment, he belongs more to the universe of elemental forces, of motions and spirits, than he does to ours. So that's Bloom's quick gloss on one of the earlier episodes, in which, again, what should come out of these moments, okay, where you suddenly become very afraid because something supernatural seems to be facing you in the natural world, seems to emerge from the natural world, some kind of huge, mysterious force pops up, as it were, literally in the case of the cliff, right? You should take something away from that. What is it that you should take? But some sense that we live in this, as he puts it, universe, as Bloom puts it here, this universe of elemental forces, of motions and spirits that is different from our everyday lives. And this can be quite a salutary thing, because it gives you, does it not, a sense of mystery, a sense of awe, and a sense of perhaps of respect as much as anything else for the world outside of you, and especially that world as it is made by the world itself, as opposed to like in the city. Like we don't tend to see too many of these passages in Wordsworth that are set in an urban environment. Okay, but that's for a later discussion. Bloom continues, these early incidents of participation in other modes of being. All he really means by that is a mode of being that's other than our normal, everyday, kind of boring mode of being, in which everything is pretty regular. You're not very afraid. You're not very awestruck. You're not really living in a world where you feel that there are these big things at stake, right? And these big forces at play. These early incidents of participation in other modes of being climax the passage quoted by Olivia, a portion of which is quoted by Olivia in our previous plate, the famous episode of the stolen boat, quote, an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. There's a muffled sexual element in this boyish escapade, which we don't need to get into in this moment. The moon shines on the child as he lustily dips his oars into the silent lake, suddenly from behind a craggy steep that has been till then the horizon's bound. And here again is that passage. A huge peak, black and huge, as with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. You know, as though it's autonomous and spontaneous and is independent of you, and it's living, and it kind of looks at you titanically, because you've done this thing that is not very respectful of it. You've stolen this natural guy's boat to ride out on this natural guy's lake, and you've done it just in this sort of childish, boyish, act of mischievousness. And you're not really being respectful enough as far as the natural world is concerned. The grim shape, Bloom continues, with its own purpose, and the measured motion of a living thing comes striding after him. He flees, returns the boat, and for many days is haunted by a sense of unknown modes of being. So you see that phrase on other modes of being, unknown modes of being, is originally Wordsworth's and is picked up by Bloom as a good phrase to emphasize. And here's a very good quote from the conclusion of this episode. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky. That's not what he remembers. All the beautiful stuff he doesn't remember anymore. It's something more sublime that he remembers. No colors of green fields, all those pleasing, picturesque presences just sort of fade away, right? But huge and mighty forms, that's what sticks with him, that do not live like living men, move slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. So you see, even breaking down the distinction between reality and fantasy and the distinction between, right, dreams and waking life. And Bloom says, I think a little bit hyperbolically, this is a fundamental paganism, so primitive that it cannot yield to any more sophisticated description without distortion. It is like the Titanism of Blake with its giant forms like the Zoas wandering a world substantially our own. Now, we didn't get into those prophecies of Blake's where we run into those Titans very much. But think a little bit of like Earth, that figure Earth in the introduction to the Songs of Experience. You know, Earth is has a little song unto itself, has an answer for what is said by the jealous, father of jealousy, Nobodaddy, also known as Urizen. Worth particular attention is the momentary withdrawal of the given world of nature from the boy. All the pleasant images go away, all the pretty stuff goes away. For it hints that familiar natural beauty is a gift, not to be retained by the unnatural. So when you behave unnaturally, for example, you go out on a lake like that, mischievously, and kind of use it. This happens in nutting. You kind of use it for like your little fantasies that don't have anything to do with respect for the world beyond you. You are sometimes punished a bit, right? There's a momentary withdrawal of the given world of nature. The pretty gifts that nature gives to us get withdrawn from us in those moments. And that's part of the lesson that you learn, right? Now, here's the Baylor gloss on the same episode. Wordsworth relates one such formative moment in the shaping of his imagination. They've been talking about formative moments in the well-known passage below from the first book of the Prelude. He says that as a young boy he was led by nature, the her mentioned in the first line, to borrow a boat under cover of night, really steal it. I mean, he's going to probably return it, but the experience he recalls occurred when as a schoolboy around the age of 10. This actually happened to Wordsworth. He took a long holiday journey from Hawkshead in the southeast part of the Lake District to Penrith in the northeast. On the way, he spent the night in Patterdale, a town about 20 miles north of Hawkshead on the edge of a large mountain-ringed lake called Ullswater. And you can still visit these places. They're still over there, and you can still have these experiences for yourself. What's cool about the Baylor group is that they actually went and got a boat and went out there and tried to see whether they could recapitulate this experience. And supposedly, it was amazing how accurate his Wordsworth's account in the poem is, of what happens when you do what he said he did. At night, the young Wordsworth crept from under his bed and stole along the banks of Ullswater until he found an unattended shepherd's boat tied to a willow tree below a, quote, rocky steep. Untying the boat, he quickly rowed towards the middle of the lake, troubled all the while by guilt. As he sped over the waves under the moonlight, he kept a steady view upon the top of that same craggy ridge that had loomed over him in the boat when he first loosened it from the willow tree. All of a sudden, from behind that first rocky steep, a second huge cliff, it's about third or fourth time I'm going to be quoting the line at this point, as with voluntary power, upreared its head. The faster he rode, right, the taller the second cliff seemed to grow, as like a living thing it strode after me. Trembling, he rowed back to shore. This is, of course, because the taller cliff had been hidden from his view by the rocky steep under which he first found the boat. As he rowed further out, the obscured cliff rose into view. Now, here's a little gloss. The Wordsworth, of course, knew his feeling of being chased as a guilty thief by a cliff was a trick of perception. For days, his mind was filled with visions of huge inhuman shapes in motion, haunting him with a sense of unsettling mystery. Prompted by his experience of a specific place, his imagination had begun to envisage things that had no location in the known world, those unknown modes of being. Once again, the mind of a poet was being formed by, again, fostered by fear as well as beauty. And here is Wordsworth's ministry of fear well